The media multiplies the problems and thereby expand, beyond the capacity of any person to solve them, the number of solutions needed. This expansion of the problems we face can be debilitating, especially when they are interlinked. How do we solve the problem of homelessness, when spending more money on housing raises the debt, and debit is another serious problem we cannot solve? To solve the debt problem requires raising taxes or reducing spending, which worsens the problem of taxation or our ability to fight crime, homelessness, and other social problems. There are 10 major problems. These are unemployment, debt, poverty, inflation, pollution, waste, taxation, homelessness, war, and crime. Some overlap, some are included in others. Hunger is a problem of poverty, so is homelessness. But homelessness is a problem of sufficient scope. It is usually tackled as a separate issue from the general problem of poverty. Inflation is generally a problem of taxation. Yet it also is looked at as a separate category. The problem is not the multiplicity of causative factors. We may see a lot of problems, but we do not see a lot of causes. If we think about the situation, claims that there is more than one source of these problems is logically incoherent. It would be akin to an evolutionist claiming every life form arose independently of the others. Problems are symptoms of something deeper and more corrosive than the symptoms it gives rise to. It ought to be obvious that at some level these problems are all interrelated. If they are interrelated and impact each other, they have a common origin. As such, it is almost impossible to think of getting rid of any one of these problems, without getting rid of them all. But as this seems impossible to comprehend, governments and various charities attempt to change the incidence or severity of one or more without even attempting to deal with them all. But more likely than not, reducing the severity of one problem contributes to the worsening of others. We know these problems are not unrelated, so why keep pitting one problem against the other, as if they are in competition with each other? Those who want to end homelessness are not the enemies of those who wish to eliminate debt and taxation. But the way we isolate and try and tackle these symptoms of a failed system, one by one, makes us seem enemies and the opponents of each other. Below we will look at how the state's attempts to address major social problems often have unintended consequences, exacerbating other issues due to complex interdependencies, misaligned incentives, or incomplete policy design. Then we will demonstrate how all of these problems have a single root cause. More importantly, perhaps, we will demonstrate how it is the state that is the carrier of this disease. This discussion will focus on 3 specific social problems: poverty, housing affordability, and crime, showing how the normal responses governments take, can and usually do, worsen other social issues. Indeed, it is fair to say that it is the state's attempt to address these issues that causes them to worsen. This discussion will focus on 3 out of the 10 issues so as to provide depth and detail. However, other issues will be addressed in passing. Poverty affects millions globally, but every nation has its own poor. Governments the world over attempt to alleviate poverty using welfare. These programs have different forms, e.g., cash transfers, food stamps, unemployment benefits. Programs like Canada's Guaranteed Income Supplement, GIS, or the US's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, provide direct financial aid to low-income individuals. To lower the number of applicants and prevent people from accessing the programs unfairly, policies often tie benefits to income thresholds. Employment is encouraged while support for the unemployed poor is provided. However, poverty is relative. Generous welfare benefits can create disincentives to work, worsening unemployment. For example, in Canada, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, CRB, during COVID-19, 2020, provided $2,000 monthly, leading some low-wage workers to opt out of jobs, as noted in a 2021 Bank of Canada report. This contributed to labor shortages, with 5.3% unemployment in 2021 despite job vacancies. Welfare programs targeting specific groups, e.g., single parents, seniors, can actually deepen inequality, other low-income groups are excluded. In the U.S., SNAP eligibility excludes many childless adults, leaving them vulnerable, per a 2023 USDA study, which found 12% of non-recipients faced food insecurity versus 8% of recipients. High welfare spending increases budget deficits, diverting funds from other areas like education or healthcare. Taking money from employers and from some sectors of the economy can reduce overall job prospects. If welfare reduces demand for local products, the domestic economy can be harmed by efforts to subsidize the poor. Canada's welfare spending rose 10% from 2015 to 2020, squeezing education budgets, which grew only 2%, as per Statistics Canada. This increase led to teacher shortages and larger class sizes. Canada's asylum seeker support, e.g., housing, healthcare. Strained resources, increasing public resentment and exacerbating housing affordability issues, as funds were diverted from domestic poverty alleviation to subsidize people who had never contributed into the system. In short, welfare programs reduce immediate poverty levels but can trap recipients in dependency, raise unemployment, and widen inequality by unevenly distributing aid. Fiscal pressures also limit investment in complementary social services, creating a feedback loop. Money going to aid is not money invested in the economy and in the creation of new jobs. Housing affordability is a global crisis, with urban rents and home prices outpacing wages, as seen in Canada's 23% rent increase for new tenants in 2024, from our prior discussion. The lack of affordable housing is part of the rise in poverty but is generally considered separately. Canada's first-time home buyer incentive or U.S. tax credits for low-income housing aim to make homes accessible. Yet these programs do not deal with the underlying problem, which is the disconnect between income and house prices. Cities like Toronto and New York also impose caps on rent increases to protect tenants. However, these policies do not address the costs that investors must pay to purchase and maintain the rental property. Governments relax zoning laws or fund affordable housing projects to boost supply. Toronto approved single-family homes being turned into fourplexes, allowing basements, attics and garages to be rented out. Lately they have discussed permitting sixplexes to be put on what was previously land for a single-family home. There is little discussion on what this will do to parking, road congestion, quality of life issues or crime levels. We do know that rent controls discourage landlords from maintaining or building rental units, and this ultimately reduces supply. A 2019 study by the University of Toronto found that Ontario's rent controls led to a 15% drop in rental construction, tightening the market and driving up uncontrolled rents. Subsidies often benefit higher-income households disproportionately. In Canada, the First-Time Home Buyer Incentive, 2019, aided buyers with incomes up to $120,000, excluding the poorest, per a 2022 CMHC report, thus widening wealth gaps. Relaxed zoning to spur housing development and densities, lead to urban sprawl, destroying green spaces. In the U.S., suburban expansion driven by housing incentives contributed to 10% of wetland loss from 1980 to 2020, per the EPA, harming ecosystems. Canada's high immigration levels, 3.3% population growth in 2022 to 2023, strained housing, and government subsidies for asylum seekers housing, e.g., $1 billion in 2023. Competed with domestic needs, fueling public frustration and exacerbating inequality perceptions. The question is how increased migration helps reduce carbon footprints or the strain on public services. In short, housing interventions by the state distort markets, favor certain groups over others and ultimately reduces supply. Money spent on public housing diverts resources from other social priorities. We get what the government wishes to give, rather than in accordance with the priorities of Canadians, as expressed through the market. Crime, including violent crime and property theft, undermines public safety, prompting governments to act decisively. If crime cannot be effectively eliminated, over time the state looks weak and irrelevant. Eliminating or reducing crime to minimal levels seems the least a government ought to be able to do. Policies like mandatory minimum sentences and increased enforcement ought to reduce crime, but governments in the Western world seem to be going the other route. CCTV facial recognition cameras, and predictive policing tools can also reduce crime and increase apprehensions. Governments also invest in rehabilitation or youth programs to address root causes with uncertain results. It is argued that tough-on-crime policies disproportionately target marginalized groups, deepening social divides. In the U.S., Black Americans are incarcerated at 5 times the rate of whites, 2023 NAACP data, often for nonviolent offenses, limiting their economic opportunities and perpetuating poverty cycles. However, blacks disproportionately kill whites, and black-on-white rape is at epidemic levels while the reverse is non-existent. Mass incarceration disrupts communities, contributing to substance abuse. A 2021 NIH study linked parental incarceration to a 20% higher risk of opioid use among children, exacerbating addiction crises. But the question is, what do we do about the higher rates of crime in some communities, not what impact does punishing criminals have on their families? Over-policing in schools diverts resources from education to security. In Canada, Toronto schools spent $30 million on police presence, 2008 to 2020. Cutting counseling budgets, per a 2022 TDSB report, which correlated with higher dropout rates among at-risk youth. This brings up the question as to what is over-policing. How do we deal with bullying in schools and with minors dealing drugs to other minors? Canada's Strong Borders Act, June 2025, and U.S. policies linking immigration to crime, e.g., Trump's 2025 border rhetoric, have seemed to scapegoat migrants. But if the state cannot deal with crimes committed by domestic criminals, why import populations linked to certain crimes to add fuel to the fire? Governments often focus on short-term relief and quick fixes without addressing root causes that exacerbate other issues but get them elected. Canada's immigration policies, while addressing labor shortages, also lowered wages, increased poverty levels, strained housing and public services, and amplified inequality and public discontent. This has been a short and cursory survey of the social problems we all see and understand. We are all familiar with the hodgepodge of state solutions and the convenient arguments that highlight just how complex the problems are. This is to be expected from the source of these problems. The state cannot solve what the state creates. To understand this better, let's look at the problem using the widest possible lens. What happens in every case is that the state identifies a problem and offers a solution. In every case, the problem is a lack of something. A situation exists that exhibits an empty place. Something is missing. But here is the real issue. The state looks at a population and says it lacks money or housing or policing. But the state has none of these things, and it has nothing that might produce these things. All it has is power and authority, and so it uses this to take what it needs to give to the population that is in need. In simple terms, the state robs Peter to give to Paul. That is all it does, that is all it ever does, and that is all it can ever do. The state has no capability whatsoever to do anything but elicit an illicit transfer of wealth. Think of it. Everything the state does comes down to an illicit removal of wealth from an innocent third party to enable the state to benefit a co-conspirator. That is it. Everything a state does comes down to a criminal conspiracy perpetuated against an innocent third party. But surely you see how simple everything really is. The innocent party does not need the state and does not need help, because it pays its own costs and has nothing missing that it cannot supply out of its own productivity. The state and its co-conspirators create the need for the state and its illicit transfers of wealth. Stop the transfers, force any illicit transfers to be reimbursed, and the state is irrelevant, and all those problems are seen as symptoms of a problem with one solution. End all illicit transfers. If you did not create it, you have no claim to it. Separate from people who think they have a right to what they did not create, and you will cease to have any problems. It really is that simple.